When you're a cop in a small town, every call from work makes your heart race. Sometimes they're little calls. Someone keyed someone's car, someone broke a window, someone shoplifted a quart of milk or ripped a few Huggies out of the box. Janine Collins ran a red light and almost hit Angela Brennan, which would have been a big deal if her brakes weren't faulty and she weren't sober. Those little calls make up most of the year, and you're glad they do, because the big calls are so bad you talk about them for years afterwards. A fire at Mrs. Branzino's takes out half the house and burns her leg something awful. You went to school with her kids and your kids go to school with her grandkids. Her son Mike asked you to prom and you said no, and when he sees what happened to his mother, he passes out and hits his head, and he's in the hospital for a week afterwards. She recovers better than he does. Nick Rodriguez, only 15, with his whole life and the whole world ahead of him. No one saw it coming because he was an honor roll student and on the football team and outwardly happy. Sometimes you're having a good day, and then you see a kid that looks a little bit like him, and then suddenly you see him in his room like you found him, and for some reason you get stuck on the fact that he was barefoot, but only wearing one sock. You wonder for days on end where that other sock was. Yesterday I got a big call, the biggest yet. I can feel it spreading already, heavy in the air and hollow. Already it's swallowing conversations and people and days, weeks, months, years. I was at the movies with Chris, my youngest. Something about robots. He'd already seen it twice, once with friends, the second time with his father and older sister, but he said he wanted to see it again with me. I didn't mind, even if I don't get sci-fi movies. I was just glad he wanted to hang out with me. I got the call in the middle of what I assume was the big showdown at the end, a confusing light show that made my eyes water and was so loud I felt the phone and didn't hear it. I didn't hear what Monica was saying either, so I stood and shuffled awkwardly around people's feet and out into the hall. "What'd you say?" I asked. "It's Becca Campbell," Monica said. Only in a small town would she say Becca instead of Rebecca. Only in a small town would I know who she was talking about instantly. What she looked like, where she lived, how young she was, how innocent. "How bad is it?" I asked, even if I already knew it was bad. No one starts a call with "it's" and then a person's name unless something really bad happened to them. "It's bad," Monica said. I remembered then that Monica's girl played volleyball with Becca. "Is she at the house?" "Yes," Monica said. "Her parents found her outside. It's her boyfriend too, Anna. They found him in the backyard." "I'm on my way," I said. "Tell Jordan to keep Paul and Nicole outside if he can. Don't let them touch anything. Tell them to cordon the area off too. No cell phones or pictures or goddamn TikToks." I turned around, ready to drag Chris out of his seat, but I found he had followed me into the hallway, a worried look on his face and more than a little curiosity in his eyes. His mom's a cop. He knows when something bad's happening and he can't resist its pull. "I have to drop you off at your father's," I said. "Where's Vivi?" Chris shrugged and made a face, like I'd just asked him about the whereabouts of the lost city of Atlantis instead of his older sister. "Someone died," Chris said. A statement, not a question. "I'm not sure yet, but I was, and judging by Monica's voice, it wasn't just bad but weird. Bad murders get better after a while. If a husband kills his wife, the town's possessed by the spirit of true crime excitement for a few weeks, maybe a year. Then something worse happens somewhere else and things die down. But weird murders are something else entirely. The weirder they are, the longer they live on, the stronger the fervor is. There are a lot of towns in America that never get away from a weird murder. They become it." I dropped Chris off at Evergreen Hills Condominium, the nicest suburb on the nice part of town. I hate it because I have to hand my ID to the guard at the gate, and he calls my ex-husband and asks if I can drive into his little gated slice of paradise. He must love that, must love hearing my name on the phone and knowing that he could turn me away. But he didn't. Not tonight. He let me through and let me drive up to his house and drop our son off outside. He opened the door for Chris, ruffled his hair, kissed him on the forehead and pulled him in for a big hug. He never even looked up at my car. I didn't mind. Not that night. I had somewhere to be. Luckily, the Campbells lived on the nice side of town too, just a few minutes away from Evergreen Hills. They didn't live in a gated community. Instead, their home sat on the edge of the hill like a white spaceship with floor-to-ceiling windows and wooden decks, and an infinity pool. On most nights, I'd envy that home and the people in it. Not yesterday. Not when the nice driveway was clogged with half of the patrol cars at the station, 3 ambulances, and one of the town's only fire engines. What the hell happened? Nicole Campbell was on a stretcher, her face puffy and covered in tears, her blouse covered in vomit, an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. Paul Campbell wasn't on a stretcher, but he was sitting on the curb with his head in his hands and a horrible look on his face. He met my gaze and waved, a polite smile grazing his lips for a moment before his mouth slumped open again and his eyes went distant. Jordan ran up to me, his deputy shirt still a few sizes too big on his skinny frame. It had been a year, and we still couldn't one that fit. She's... Jordan started. Just lead the way, I said, and I immediately saw why he had hesitated. There was no way to be led to. Becca was right there, hanging from a tree in the Campbell's front lawn with a noose around her neck, a landline phone in her hand, and her guts hanging out of wide horizontal gash that split her stomach from one side to the other. One of her intestines draped out of the cut like a streamer, dangling between her legs and pooling on the ground. For some reason, my first thought was that it looked fake, like a Halloween decoration or something out of a movie. Jordan said. I nodded and followed him through the house. There'd been some kind of fire. My eyes watered and the house still reeked of smoke. We walked through the empty frame of a shattered sliding glass door, sidestepping the lawn chair that had been thrown through it. Becca's boyfriend Dylan was sitting outside, his wrists duct taped to the arms of a plastic chair. His ankles were duct taped together. A few layers of duct tape covered his mouth. He was wearing a Letterman jacket, and his guts were hanging out of a massive wound on his stomach, some of them pulled out onto his lap. Dylan doesn't play football, I said. Didn't, I thought, and it was true. He wasn't on the team, so why was he wearing that jacket? Jordan gagged, turned and groaned as a string of vomit shot out of his mouth. 2 murders, I thought. Bad ones, weird ones, theatrical. There was a fire inside? I asked. Jordan nodded, then shook his head. Stove, he croaked. She was cooking something on a pan. Weird. Weird how? I asked, then walked back inside before he could answer me. I found it in the sink, a giant ball of tin foil on a pan that had been charred to a crisp. It looked vaguely familiar, old, nostalgic. I looked around the Campbell's $1 million kitchen and then I found it. A cardboard label. Jiffy Pop, some kind of popcorn that comes in an aluminum foil dish with a handle. You cook it right on the stove. We left the scene at 4 a.m. and I got home at 6, practically crawling up the cramped stairs to my shitty studio apartment. I unlocked the door, tossed my work bag on the couch, and someone screamed in response. I flipped the lights on, my hand shooting to the gun on my hip. Jesus, Mom, Vivi groaned. She was sleeping on the couch, still in her school clothes. When she was little, I loved the fact that Vivian looked like me, with her curly dark hair and dark eyes and brown skin. Now I hate the fact that she looked like me with the dark circles under her eyes, disheveled hair and wrinkled clothes. Unfocused, disorganized, mind anywhere but on her schoolwork. A lot of that is my fault, of course. You could have told me you were sleeping over. I called you 1,000,000 times, I said. And I had. I'd been calling even before I heard about Becca Campbell. Vivi started. Your phone died, I said. Sure, you heard about Becca Campbell, yeah, Vivi said. She's actually why I'm here. I raised an eyebrow. Vivi raised the remote, turned the TV on, and I clicked her way through Netflix until she found something she'd been watching before. It was the movie Scream. I'd seen it years ago with her. She loved horror movies since she was 10. I don't want to watch a movie, I said. You do, Vivi said. Trust me. She scrolled her way through the film's opening, the movie becoming a series of still images while a red bar moved along the bottom of the screen. I saw a young Drew Barrymore with a terrible blonde wig making popcorn on the stove. Vivi kept scrolling. Drew Barrymore was on the phone, talking, more talking. Then she was scared. Running, checking the locks on the doors, going to the back door. A sliding glass door. She flipped the lights on and... a boy in a Letterman jacket, duct taped to a chair in the backyard. Vivi scrolled along, and then the boy was dead, his guts hanging out of his open stomach. Vivi scrolled more and more, and then, "Holy shit," I said. "Yeah," Vivi said, freezing the image on the screen. I reached for my phone, turning to look at the screen one more time. Drew Barrymore was dead, hanging from a tree in her front yard with a noose around her neck, a landline phone in one hand, and her guts hanging out from an open wound in her stomach. It was the same. Exactly the same. I unlocked my phone and there was a message notification. A voice recording. I tapped it, then put the phone to my ear. "Hello, Sheriff Rios," a deep voice said. "Do you like scary movies?" 7 movies. 7 bodies. 7 days. Word gets out, especially in a town of less than 5,000 people. Yesterday morning we held a small conference. We don't have a dedicated conference room at the station. Whenever something big happens, which isn't often, we hold conferences at Janice McCarthy's Inn. It's the closest thing we have to a hotel. It has a dance hall for events. Mark and I had our wedding there, as did most of the people in the room. Janice helped set up the podium and snapped her fingers at Bob Nowicki, Mariana Castro, and the other young waiters that work at Anne-Marie Jackson's restaurant, which is part of the inn too. Janice and Anne-Marie are best friends, and I'm stalling. My mind's racing. The worst thing about being from a small town is that you know everyone and everyone knows you. You can't hide, especially when you're the sheriff and someone is murdered. 2 people, which makes it even worse. 2 young people, which makes it catastrophic. When we were done setting up, Janice handed me the microphone and then stood next to me in front of Jordan and a few of the other deputies. I shot her a look and she took a few steps to the right of the podium, but she stayed up there throughout the whole thing. I hate that. She does it at the weddings too. Hovers near the priest and the best man and the wedding planner. Like just because she owns the place, she's got to be a part of everything. I'm stalling again. Sorry. "Yes," I started. Then everyone in the room cringed under at the sharp shriek of the speaker's feedback. Janice snapped her fingers and her waiters fiddled with the thing. "Do a mic check," Janice said. 1, 2, 1. I sounded like an idiot. I looked around the room. "Can everyone hear me?" They didn't answer, but I could hear myself just fine, so I kept going. "Sorry about that," I said. "Yesterday we lost 2 of our own." Cliché, I know, but I'm not a writer and not much of a public speaker either. I'm a cop. Becca Campbell and Dylan Russell. There's no easy way to talk about this, to say that 2 young, bright, 2 good kids were killed. There was a murmur of agreement in the crowd. Anger, too. I noticed some of that anger was directed at me and the deputies around me. "I know there's been a lot of talk," I continued. I turned around and looked at my deputies, then at the dozen or so members of our local paper. Took pictures of the crime scene and shared them in a couple of group chats. Some of those pictures were posted online too. The police department's own technology team has reached out to other authorities and has gotten a lot of those pictures down. Luckily, most of them had already been tagged and flagged and taken down by the platforms themselves. I swallowed, suddenly remembering that I shared the case myself on this site. I reminded myself that I had done it in desperation, in the hope that maybe someone online could help me make sense of it. I have no doubt that, when this is all over, I'll probably be let go for doing it. I'll probably be run out of town. I think that'd be for the best. We haven't had a murder in this town in close to 20 years, and back then, this social media stuff wasn't an issue. I'd like to remind you that sharing details of an ongoing police investigation is a crime. I wasn't sure of that, actually. I'm not sure of it even now. It's probably bullshit, but I felt it gave me a little authority in the face of the online monster. It's obstruction of justice, but I'm not here to tell you not to share photos of the crime scene because you'll get in trouble with the legal system. No, I'm here to tell you that sharing those photos is disgusting. I can't stop small-town gossip or morbid curiosity, but I will do everything in my power to stop people from gawking at 2 dead kids like there's some kind of sick attraction. More murmurs, some nervous glances too. Please disregard any rumors. Don't believe anything you hear unless it's from me or a member of our law enforcement team. I'll take a few questions today. Please remember to respect the privacy of the families involved. I answered a few questions as best I could. Whether we were considering this a homicide? Yes. What time were the victims killed? We're still waiting on word from the coroner, probably in a few hours. Where were the victims killed? Same answer as before. Luckily, no one asked me about horror movies. No one asked me about Scream. I think that only my daughter made the connection, and I don't think she'd share it online. She wants to be a cop, like me. Wants to be in on the investigation. The more confidential the better, as far as she's concerned, like being part of an exclusive club. She told me as much a few hours later at the station. I gave her one of our awful coffees, then put her in my office. Then I walked into a conference room with Jordan. "Sit," I said. Jordan sat down. "I'll only ask this once," I said. "Did you take photos of the crime scene?" "With the department's camera," Jordan said. "You told me to." "Not crime scene photos," I said. "Cell phone photos." "No," Jordan said. "Do you know who did?" Jordan shook his head, but he looked nervous, pale, guilty. "Was there anyone hanging around the bodies? Maybe you turned your back or another deputy did." Jordan told me a few of the firemen did, some of the first responders. I sighed. It was my fault for not being there sooner. "Do me a favor and keep an eye on my daughter. I'm going to see Paul Warren." "I should go with you," Jordan said. "What did I just say?" Jordan nodded. "Our town doesn't have a morgue or a medical examiner, but there's one the next town over. Paul Warren's a local, friend of the family, friend of my father's. He was like an uncle. I trust him." When I walked into the room where Paul does the autopsies, I don't know the name for it. It's a smaller room. Cold. Smells awful. Like chemicals and something dead underneath. "Anna," Paul said, mimicking the act of pulling me into a hug. He was wearing a full-body coverall. Me too. His assistant had told me to it on before walking into the room. A hairnet too. A mask. The whole 9 yards. I tried not to look at the 2 dead kids on the table. "What should I know about?" I said, motioning to the bodies. "The male victim. You know it's Dylan," I said. "You can say Dylan." Paul smiled sadly. Dylan suffered multiple injuries to the cranial region. Examination revealed evidence of at least 12 separate strikes with what was most likely a metal object. It's my opinion that these blows were done to render him unconscious, but the blows were so strong they actually shattered the cranium and caused severe intracranial hemorrhage. The evidence points to the fact that he died from the blows to the head. He didn't die from the cut on his stomach. No, the wounds on his stomach came after. "Wounds?" I asked. "It looks like one big slash to me." His stomach was split horizontally, which took considerable effort. I found evidence of 18 different cuts in several different directions, some of them as high up as his sternum. Whoever did this wanted to disembowel him, but I don't think they imagined how hard it'd be. "Not as easy as it looks in the movies," I said. Paul shot me a strange look. "I guess not," he said. "She died before being disemboweled too. At least a dozen stab wounds to the chest. A few of them severed her aorta." "Anything else?" I asked, eager to change the subject. "The phone in her hand," Paul said. "What about it?" "It was super glued to her palm. Post-mortem, that's strange, right?" "Not if he wanted her to be found with the phone in her hand." "He staged her," Paul said. "Theatrical." "Not theatrical," I said. "Cinematic." "Thank you, Paul." I was on my way back to town when I got the call. Luckily, it was on my way, right on the edge of our town. There was nothing else lucky about this one. There's an old well on the Harrison's farm. When I was a kid, we'd sneak onto the property and drop coins into it. Make wishes. I actually believed they'd come true. Kid shit. After we did it a couple of times, old man Harrison chased us off the farm with a shotgun in his hand. My father almost had a heart attack when I told him. I thought he'd be angry at me. Instead, he drove over and knocked Harrison on his ass. Said if he ever took a gun out in front of his daughter or any of the kids in town, they'd find his body in the well. It was Harrison's daughter who made the call. There was a girl reported missing 2 towns over. There was a conference, held by the police and her parents a few days ago. They asked people in the surrounding area to check creeks, holes, old fridges, or washing machines on their properties. Wells, too. Harrison's daughter looked out of her window and saw the well. She told us she was sure there'd be nothing in it. It was an old thing anyway. They kept it covered with a heavy piece of wood because her own daughter had almost fallen into it once. She went out and got one of the Miller boys to help her take the cover off. That boy said Mrs. Harrison damn near fainted when she saw it, but she insisted on making the call anyway, because it was her property. I got there just as Jordan and a couple of our other deputies were pulling up. I made my way to the well, took my flashlight off my belt, and shone it down the length of moldy stones all the way to the bit of water at the bottom. The girl was wearing a white dress with long sleeves. Her long black hair was draped over her face. Her bare legs were bloated, green and blue and gray. She had to have been there since she went missing. A couple of days at least. The girl's name was Samantha. "Sheriff," the Miller boy said, "we found this in the well's bucket. Damn thing almost fell into the well, but I caught it just in time." He smiled proudly at that. He handed it to me. A black box. No, a black VHS tape. I turned it over to check the label. Force of habit. There was a white label on it, faded yellow. On it were 2 words. 7 days. Because Samantha was from one town over, the crime scene was more crowded, more complicated to navigate. Her parents showed up, her brothers and sister too. They wanted to see her, touch her. Her mother shouted at the EMS responders to check her heart rate, give her oxygen, do chest compressions. "Ma'am," one of them said softly. He didn't need to say anything else. We all knew what he meant. She was dead, had been for a while. There was no bringing her back. The chief of police from Samantha's town showed up with a couple of patrol cars. They sent ambulances and a fire engine too, to help get the body out of the well. I told him we managed just fine, but thanks. He asked me for photos of the scene. He didn't say crime scene, probably because he thought it was an accident. I told him I'd send them over. I remembered suddenly that the tape was in my pocket. We hadn't photographed it, hadn't entered it into evidence. There was still time, but I held on to it anyway. I rationalized it. The body had been found in our town. It was our jurisdiction. I'd share the tape and its contents with them later. No need to make the parents feel any worse by bringing some old horror movie into this. This was real. Their real daughter found that way. Their real daughter dead. Not a prop in a sick bastard's game. Not something to be used for set dressing or a reference to a stupid movie. "Why's she wearing that dress?" the mother asked. "She wasn't wearing that dress." Paul was the ME for Samantha's town. I wanted to talk to him about the case like I had about Becca and Dylan, but I couldn't. Not here. He'd report his findings to that sheriff first. Jurisdiction, complications. I'd ask him about it later. We trusted each other in that way. In the meantime, I had a tape to watch. I walked up to my car just in time to see Jordan pull up, with Vivi in the passenger seat. As soon as Jordan stepped out of the car, I practically tackled him. "You brought my daughter here?" I asked. "This is a crime scene." "You told me to watch her," Jordan said. "I didn't want to leave her alone at the station. She rode her bike there and it's dark and—" "You left me here all day," Vivi said, shouting from the back seat, "like a prisoner." She tried opening the door, but it wouldn't budge. Vivi knew that it wouldn't open. She'd ridden in patrol cars since she was a kid. But in all the excitement, she must have forgotten. I was livid. She wanted to get out. No, she felt she had the right to get out. The right to go up to the well and gawk at a dead girl's body. The right to walk onto the crime scene. And why? Because she was my daughter. Because she liked horror movies. Because she had the same morbid curiosity that was running rampant in this small town. I took a deep breath, feeling the heat on my cheeks dissipate. It took a lot of the anger with it as it went. I reached out and opened the door. "I didn't tell Jordan to hold you there," I said, leaning in to look Vivi in the eyes. "I just told him to watch you, but he shouldn't have brought you here." "What's that?" Vivi asked, pointing to my jacket. My stomach sank. The VHS tape was sticking out of my pocket. "A VHS tape?" "No," I said. "It's nothing." "It's a VHS tape, isn't it?" As soon as Jordan said they found a girl in a well, I knew it was related. That's what I wanted to tell you yesterday. Like the message on your phone. 7 movies, 7 bodies, 7 days. 7 days is right out of the ring. "How'd you know about the message on my phone?" I asked. "You kept playing it over and over again," Vivi said. "Not just in your ear, but when you had the phone on your hand. I thought you knew I heard it." She suddenly looked hurt. It reminded me of when she was a kid, when I'd accuse her of something that her brother had done. "All right," I said. Let's get back to the station and check out the tape. I've got the crime scene photos, Jordan said, holding up his camera. I could tell he was excited. The only crime scene photos he'd ever taken were of broken windows, scratched up cars, or empty spaces left behind by stolen property. All right, follow us to the station, I said. Before I left, I caught Paul talking to the other sheriff. We shared a look. I tried to keep my face neutral. I didn't want him to know that these two cases are related. Not yet, and certainly not in the way that they are, as references to famous screen killings. So far, we've managed to avoid any mention of horror movies altogether. I'd own our local little newspaper to start calling these the horror movie killings, or like the commenter Dear Original 675 suggested, dubbing whoever is behind this the thriller killer. The last thing I need is more attention on this. I'm already risking enough by posting it on here. I hope that the risk is worth it, that your comments, suggestions, and even theories might help me make sense of it. Vivi sat in the passenger seat on the ride back to the station. I keep referring to her as Vivi, but a few weeks ago she threw this huge fit over it, saying that Vivi sounds stupid and childish. We've called her Vivi since she was a baby. She said that her friends call her Viv, and her dad too. So I relented and called her Viv for a few days. Then she said it sounded wrong and said that I should call her Vivi. Her friends and her dad still get to call her Viv though. So, I started. Chris tells me you have a boyfriend. Mom, Vivi said. Stop. What? You've had boyfriends before. Not real ones, I was like 13. But this one's real. I guess. I don't know, I hope so. So tell me about him. Vivi sighed dramatically. It's not a big deal. Chris said he had a car, that he picks you up and drops you off late. I'm gonna kill that little asshole. Hey, I shouted. He's just worried about you. He shouldn't be, and he shouldn't tell on me either. I don't tell you about the shit he does, like the fact that he's hanging out with Aaron and Lee and smoking pot behind the movie theater. Well, I didn't know that, I said, and I'm not happy about it. But you didn't have to turn it into all this. It was just a question. You're my daughter. If you're dating a guy and he has a truck and he drives you around at night, I should know about it. Can we talk about something else, please? Vivi said. Like maybe about the fact that there's a fucking serial killer in town and that he's obsessed with horror movies. Language, I said. And all right, fine. Do you have any leads? That's confidential. You don't, do you? I sighed. She was right. We were looking into Becca Campbell's friends, ex-boyfriends, schedule and activities on the days surrounding her murder. Nothing jumped out at us. Nothing out of the ordinary. Ditto for Dylan Russell. He hadn't gotten into any fights at school, wasn't tied to our town's drug scene. Dylan wasn't a bully or a stereotypical jock, and he didn't make enemies as far as we knew. He was a good kid. I didn't know Samantha Harris, but I'm sure there'd be nothing on that front too. No fingerprints? Vivi asked. No, I said. Or at least none we could find. Mason Bradley, Allie Park, and Stephanie Crawford aren't exactly a world-class CSI team. I think they were careful. They? I asked. You think we're dealing with two killers? No, Vivi said. I don't know, but no, I don't think so. I said that because I don't know who it is. Oh, I said. I was thinking about something, Vivi said. 7 movies, 7 bodies, 7 days, right? So far it's been 2 days and 2 movies, but 3 victims. First Scream and now The Ring. Yeah, I said. So? The count's already off. There was 1 extra victim on day 1. She was right. You think you think they made a mistake? No. Scream's opening scene has 2 victims. They replicated the scene as well as they could. Dylan and Becca even look a little like the victims. So if we assume So if they keep going like this with 1 movie and 1 victim each day, there are 5 days left and 5 movies but only 4 victims. How could they reference 7 movies but only kill 6 people? It has to be 7 bodies, right? Yeah, Vivi said. That's what I was thinking about. And I think I know the answer. What? 7 and 7 and 7. Yeah. There's a movie called 7. It actually inspired the Saw franchise. In that movie, the killer references the 7 deadly sins by killing 7 people. Well, he kills 6, but 7 die, but I guess that's a spoiler. Okay, so? This whole thing is a reference to the movie 7. They've already killed 3 people and referenced 3 movies: Scream, The Ring, and Seven. That leaves only 4 movies and 4 victims, but 5 days. They're not gonna kill anyone the last day, I said. Not if they want only 7 victims, no, Vivi said, smiling. And judging how strict they've been with their references, I don't think they'd spoil all this by screwing the numbers up. Good job, I said. Despite how horrible this whole thing had been, I actually enjoyed talking with Vivi, spending time with her, working the case with her. It was like a book or a Lifetime movie, a sheriff solving crimes with her daughter. When we got to the station, I put the VHS tape into one of the VCRs in the video room. We still have VCRs, yeah. Cops use them a lot. A series of confusing images showed up, like a strange black and white avant-garde student film. It lasted only a few minutes. When it was done, Vivi looked at me and smiled. That's the tape from The Ring, she said. I'm pretty sure they just ripped it straight from the DVD's special features. It's scary how much you know about this, I said. I love horror movies, Vivi said, shrugging. You know that. The next morning, Vivi and I got up at the same time, got dressed at the same time, and rode to the station together. It was like we'd both agreed, without talking about it, that we'd be a team on this. I didn't really have a choice. I didn't want to bring someone in on this that I couldn't trust, and I didn't know anyone who knew horror movies like Vivi. We were pulling up to the station when we got the call. Anna, Monica asked. She was our dispatcher/secretary/general assistant. Another body? I asked. Well, yes, Monica said. But that's not all? It's Jordan, Monica said. Harriet said he didn't come home last night. Vivi and I shared a look. I called the medical examiner too, a doctor. What did Paul say? He didn't say anything. I got his assistant. He said that Paul didn't come into work. They called his wife, and apparently he didn't come home last night either. Another 2 victims, Vivi mouthed. We don't know that it's related, I said. Let's just focus on the call for now. Where is it? I could have dropped Vivi off at the station, but I wanted her with me. She made me feel better about all this. We pulled up to a house. It was a new family. I didn't know them. Even in a small town, you can't know everyone. And I was glad I didn't know them. I don't know if I would have been able to handle the sounds the parents made when we walked into the home if I had known them or their dead kid. I walked up the stairs to their daughter's room and opened the door. I flipped on the lights and immediately wished I hadn't. There was a girl sitting on her bed. She was wearing a blue nightgown, old-fashioned. It was covered in green vomit. The girl was sitting with her back to me, but I could still see her face, could see the discoloration on it, the cuts, the bruises. I could see all of it because the girl was facing me, even if her back was turned to me. She was facing me because her head had been twisted 180 degrees. I don't know many horror movies, but I knew this one. The Exorcist. With Paul missing, a different medical examiner handled the scene. He didn't tell me much at the scene, but he said enough to make my stomach flip. There are bruises on her wrists and ankles, he said. He bound her tight, probably to keep her still while he twisted her head around. He? I asked. The ME shrugged. Things like this? Usually a man that does it. Look up the statistics. Plus, you'd need a lot of upper body strength to twist someone's head around like this, even a young girl's. He mimed the act and made a crack sound with his mouth. That's a dead kid right there, I said. You make a sound like that again, I'll crack your fucking jaw. He held up his hands in a sorry kind of way. Asshole. I questioned the parents as best I could. They'd gone out for a movie, the same sci-fi one I saw with my son Chris. Their daughter didn't want to go. At 13, she was right at the age where family outings were no longer mandatory. They wanted to give her a bit of freedom. They'd never get the chance to make that mistake again. The girl always locked the door, and there was a doorbell camera. Unfortunately, there were no cameras in the rear of the house, no alarms, and no locks on the girl's bedroom window on the second floor. The killer used a ladder from the tool shed in the backyard, set it against the wall, and climbed up to the girl's bedroom window. She must have been downstairs, in the kitchen. There was a broken plate on her bedroom door and some uneaten avocado toast. He ambushed her as soon as she walked into her room. The mother said the nightgown the girl was wearing wasn't hers. The killer changed her clothes so that she looked more like Regan, the girl from the film. I looked up the movie on my phone. The victim was wearing screen-accurate clothing, just like Dylan's Letterman jacket, or the white dress Samantha, the Ring victim, was wearing. Whoever the killer is, they have an obsession for accuracy. The asshole ME also revealed that the Exorcist victim had a nasty wound to the back of the head, probably to knock her out. I hoped that, like Dylan, the girl had passed away from it long before the killer twisted her head around. Before I left, the asshole ME said something that gave me goosebumps. He tried to keep her eyes and mouth open, he said. What? I asked. Super glue on her eyelids here, he said. But he didn't use enough and it ran. Kept the eyes closed instead. Why do you want them open, right? Weird. There's something else too. He pointed to a plastic ring on the floor. I picked it up with my pen. I didn't know what it was. My girlfriend's studying orthodontry. Orthodontology, I said. If your girlfriend's studying it, you should know how to say it right. Okay, he said. Point is, that's one of those mouth opener things, you know? The creepy ones that give a creepy mouth? Again, why? Finding out why isn't your job, I said. It's mine. But I knew why. I hadn't seen Scream or The Ring, but I had seen The Exorcist. The scene where the little girl's head turns around is burned in my memory. Her eyes were open in that scene. She was smiling too. On my way back to my car, I threw up in the bushes. That bad? Vivi asked. I told her the details on the way to the station. Now, you may have noticed that I don't talk about the deputies much. There are 10 of them, not including Jordan and Monica, who have pretty much moved up to administrative positions along with me. Because our town is so small, the deputies are considered officers of the court and mostly do things like see to warrants, collect payments for fines, hand out parking tickets, patrol the town, collect property taxes, and act as courthouse security. I'm both the county sheriff and the chief of police in our small town. Most of the towns around ours are small and rural, so it makes sense for the chief of the biggest town to oversee the other little ones in our tiny county. We have very limited resources after all. It's just the way it's always been done. The sheriff and chief of police before me held both positions for over 50 years. I'm the first woman to occupy both roles. I think I was elected only because that man was my father. Monica and other deputies help me oversee the county as a whole, speak to local law enforcement, manage cases and permits and fines, etc. I don't want to bore you. I don't want to give my location away either. All our deputies wanted in on the murders. They're the talk of the town, after all, so I put most of them to work securing the crime scene, looking into the victims, and patrolling the area. That leaves only Monica, Jordan, and I to act as a homicide detective would. Now that Jordan's out of the picture, it leaves Monica and I. But Monica talks. More than once, I've discussed private county matters with her, financials and such, and then heard her talk about them on the phone. No, I'm keeping this one close to the chest. We can discuss everything except the horror movie references. That's how I'll crack this. If I mention it, then everyone in town will become a horror movie expert, and it'll be impossible to find someone who knew these movies well before the murders. I only know Vivi, so for now, she's almost like an acting deputy. We sat in my office drinking shitty coffee, eating cookies from the vending machine. Despite everything, it was nice. There has to be some kind of pattern, Vivi said. And what do you mean? All the movies have to have something in common. You think there's a pattern? I asked, taking a sip of the awful coffee and cringing. We really need to invest in a good coffee machine. Something all the movies have in common? Probably, but I don't think it'll help us right now. If this was the 90s, we could check Blockbuster or the library and see who checked out these movies recently. There's no way to see who rented them online, right? Vivi shook her head. Maybe if we were the FBI or the CIA or something. Do you know anyone else who loves horror movies? I asked. Maybe a friend at school, or someone your boyfriend knows. Vivi gave me a knowing glare. I don't and he doesn't. She set her coffee down and looked me in the eyes. Liking horror movies isn't a crime and having a boyfriend isn't suspicious. What's your boyfriend's name? Jacob. I sighed. That's it? No last name? We were having such a good time, Vivi said. Now you're interrogating me about my boyfriend? Hell, he isn't really my boyfriend like officially. We just went out a few times. In his truck? Vivi looked confused. He drives a Prius. Your brother said he drove a truck. Maybe he was high, Vivi said, shrugging. Car, truck, whatever. His name's Jacob Marino, by the way. God, I said. His dad asked me to prom. How many people asked you to prom? Mike, the guy who owns the sports store? Dan Robar, yeah. Now Jake's dad. I shrugged. I guess I was hot back then, I don't know. We got a good chuckle out of that. Tell Jacob I want to meet him. Fine, Vivi said. When all this is over, we'll all have coffee together like adults. Sound good? Now let's get back to the freaking serial killer obsessed with horror movies. I think that's a little more interesting than a guy who's not even really my boyfriend. The killer took Jordan and Paul Warren, I said. 2 people again, like Scream. They can't kill them both, right? 2 for Scream, 1 for The Ring, 1 for The Exorcist. There have already been 4 victims in 4 movies, if we count 7. If they kill Jordan and Paul for the next one, it'd put the count at 6, but there'd be 3 movies left. Maybe they won't kill Jordan and Dr. Warren, Vivi said. But 7 movies, 7 bodies, 7 days, I said. Yeah, but 7 bodies in total, Vivi said. They could reference a movie without killing someone, then kill 2 for the next one, or even 3. They never said 1 victim per movie. The whole thing is a reference to David Fincher's 7 anyway. There was 1 scene in that movie, Lust. I nodded. Vivi and I saw it the night before. She forced me to watch it. It was a good movie, I guess. Didn't like the ending, though. That one had 2 people, but only one of them died, Vivi said. But it was a guy and prostitute. Right, Vivi said. I don't think they'd reference 7 again either. Whatever it is, it's a movie where 2 guys are the victims. They had to take them somewhere else too, I said. They killed Becca Campbell and Dylan Russell at Becca's house. Probably because her house had sliding glass doors, a patio, and a tree in the front lawn. They're a stickler for details. They killed Lena McCarthy, the Exorcist victim, at home too. But they kidnapped the Ring victim and brought her all the way out here. There was a well in her town. A few of them, actually, I said. They must have wanted you to find her then. I put my coffee down. My stomach seemed to twist into a tight knot. You're the expert, I said. Are there any movies where 2 guys get kidnapped? Vivi scrunched up her brow. She closed her eyes. A horror movie where 2 guys get kidnapped, she muttered. It has to be a famous one too. Scream, The Ring, The Exorcist 7. Pretty mainstream so far. No deep cuts. But maybe they'll throw one in there. Something from the 70s. Very crowded decade. Lots of giallo stuff. Maybe a weird slasher from the 80s. No. Vivi looked at me. The references have been pretty obvious so far, she said. You could plug a description of the way the victims were killed into Google and you get the movie every time. So this one has to be obvious too. 2 male victims. Becca and Dylan were dating, like the victims in Scream's opening scene. The 2 girl victims looked like the horror movie characters they were referencing. There must be a reason why they picked Dylan and Dr. Warren. Probably to punish us, I said. To disrupt the investigation. They've helped me so far. Maybe, Vivi said. But I think they want the victims to be pretty similar to the ones in the movies. Dylan was blonde. Drew Barrymore's boyfriend in the movie had dark hair. So Dylan was killed because of the role he filled, not what he looked like. Jordan and Dr. Warren must have been picked for their roles too. A cop and a doctor? Practically every horror movie has a cop and a doctor in it. Vivi shrugged. I don't know. We haven't gotten the call yet and it's late, I said. Maybe they haven't killed them yet. Or maybe they just haven't been found, like the girl in the well. She was there for a day at least. Maybe they put Jordan and Paul somewhere hidden too, like a barn or an abandoned house. 2 guys, Vivi said. A cop and a doctor, hidden somewhere, not at their home or a public space, because they would have been found there, somewhere remote. Vivi's eyes drifted across my desk and stopped at the department's camera. I'd used it to take photos of the crime scene. Jordan usually takes the crime scene photos, right? Vivi asked. You called him a photographer. Yeah, I said. So? It's not a cop and a doctor then, Vivi said. Her eyes were wild with the excitement that only comes from putting a puzzle together. It's a photographer and a doctor. Both of them kidnapped, it's obvious. What? I asked. What movie is it? Saw, Vivi said. They're referencing the first Saw movie. Are there any big, creepy public bathrooms in town? Like maybe an underground one? Or something in a factory? It has to be a rundown one, too. Abandoned. Vivi, I don't know every bathroom in the county. They'd pick one we could get to quickly, Vivi said. One we'd know. In the movie, a cop rushes to the bathroom. Ah, shit. But he did it by following a suspect there. But it's gotta be a bathroom, a really big one, grimy, tiled walls. The only big underground abandoned bathroom I know is the one at the old bus station. We had to board up the whole building because squatters kept sneaking in. It was a drug den. That has to be it, Vivi said. I was skeptical. She'd solved it too easily, too quickly. She was probably wrong. Then again, Vivi has always been smart. All her teachers say she's ahead than her classmates. She reads at a grad school level at 17. We pulled up to the old bus station. It was an eyesore, one that the town council had been trying to tear down for years. But our town's historical society had put a stop to it. The building was nice, Art Deco, built in the 1930s. But they'd screwed up when they put in the water pipes. Most of them burst at the same time one summer. Damn near flooded the entire building, rotted the wood floors and wood stairs and platforms. Not it was a gutted, decaying mess. You're staying in the car, I said, opening the passenger side door and then one of the rear doors too. But, Vivi started. You'll be safe in the car, I said. I won't, Vivi said. In horror movies, the killer always targets the detective's family. I'm not a detective, I said. Sheriff, police chief, whatever, Vivi said. It's so obvious. You go in there by yourself. I stay in the car. The killer breaks the window and chloroforms me. You come out and find an empty car. Cliffhanger. I sighed. Fine, I said, but you stay behind me and use this. I gave her an extra flashlight. I should get a gun too, Vivi said, in case they try to get me from behind. This isn't a horror movie, Vivi, I said. It sure as hell feels like one. I handed Vivi my taser, the kind that shoots out prongs. Just don't hit me with that thing, I said. Vivi nodded, grabbing the taser and then pointing it around like a gun. It's not a toy, I said. Yeah, I know, but it's fun. Vivi and I walked up to a side door. The front doors had been boarded up and covered in chains. The windows were covered with thick sheets of wood. The town council wasn't messing around, but there had to be an easy point of entry, by law, in case the building caught fire or something. Not that this moldy, soggy wreck could catch fire. The side door was covered in locks and chains, but we had hidden the keys under one of the Art Deco statues near the entrance. We wouldn't be needing the keys, The side door was wide open. Shit, I said. Language, Vivi whispered. She was pale, scared. Stay behind me, I said. As soon as we walked into the building, I was hit by the stench of decades of mold and rotten wood. I tied my handkerchief around Vivi's nose and mouth and pulled my shirt over my own. We walked carefully, testing out the rotten floorboards before putting out with delicate steps, before putting our full weight on them. We found the stairs leading down to the bathrooms. The way forward was easy from there. I could see drag marks on the floor where the mold and dust had been wiped away by someone dragging something, or someone else. There was a light on in one of the bathrooms. Strange, seeing as how the building didn't have power. I saw how the killer had done it almost instantly. There were thick power cables snaking out of the bathroom doorway and slinking away through the darkness, leading deeper into the station. I could hear the hum and churn of a generator in that direction. They'd planned this, had put a lot of work into it. That scared me more than anything else. Suddenly, I remembered a line Morgan Freeman said in Seven. This guy is methodical, exacting, and worst of all, patient. I stepped through the doorway into a moldy, grimy, tile-covered bathroom. A set of new, bright, unforgiving fluorescent lights had been fitted on the ceiling. Underneath them was a giant bloodstain. I could see the imprint of a body on it, as if someone had been lying in it for hours as it dried. Anna! Jordan shrieked. He was on the other side of the room, lying in another pool of blood. He had a shackle around one of his ankles. A thick chain led from it to a series of rusted pipes in the corner. Then I saw Paul. Jordan was holding him, hugging him. Paul's head was in Jordan's lap. I could tell from where I stood that Paul was dead. He was pale, blue, and I didn't need a medical degree to see why. Paul's right foot was gone. In its place was a bloody stump.
Hey!
Jordan's eyes shot to the corner of the room next to me. I turned around and my breath hitched in my throat. Paul's foot was lying in another pool of blood with the shackle still around it. There, lying near it, was a hacksaw. "Holy shit," Vivi said. Vivi and I sat across from Jordan's hospital bed. The doctors said he should be all right. He only suffered cuts and bruises. The killer hadn't hit him in the back of the head like the other victims. They'd used chloroform. They were learning. They didn't want Jordan to die from a hit that was meant to render them unconscious, like what happened to Dylan and the Exorcist victim. I had gotten a call from the asshole ME and he confirmed it. Another brain hemorrhage. In that girl's case, I was glad she was dead before the killer got to work, undressing her and dressing her in what they'd brought, posing her like a cheap haunted house prop. "The last thing I remember was unlocking my front door," Jordan said. "Then I woke up in that bathroom." "With Paul?" I asked. "Paul and the man." Vivi and I shared a look. "What man?" I asked. "A man wearing a black hood," Jordan said. He was still groggy. The doctors had given him something for the shock. "A pig." "A pig mask," Vivi said. "Jigsaw's helpers wear them in the movies. They kidnap people." I rolled my eyes. I hate horror movies. "Don't blame the movies," Vivi said. "Blame the crazy guy who's bringing them to life." I leaned into Jordan's bed. He looked bad, groggy, pale, sedated and anxious at the same time. "What makes you think it was a man?" "He had a very deep voice," Jordan whispered, looking around nervously as if the killer could walk into the room at any moment. "Probably a voice changer," Vivi said, "like the killers in Scream. Jigsaw's copycats use them in the sequels and—" "Vivi," I said, "maybe you should wait in the hall." "Fine," Vivi said, "if you don't want my help." "I do want your help," I said, "and you're helping a lot, but I shouldn't even be here. The only reason the doctors haven't kicked me out is because I'm the sheriff." "All right," Vivi said. She walked out of the room and shut the door. I turned back to Jordan. Part of the reason why I asked Vivi to step out of the room was because I didn't want her to hear what Jordan would say next. "What happened to Paul?" Jordan's eyes met mine. They were wide with what could only be fear. I could practically hear his heart pounding. His breaths became quick and shallow and strained. "He kicked Paul awake," Jordan said. "He was worried he'd used too much to knock him out. But Paul came around. The guy walked around the room looking at everything, the lights, a clock on the wall. He was angry it didn't look perfect. He brought someone else in too, unconscious, wearing black clothes. He set him down next to me and put this metal thing next to it. He'd painted it to look like something you put on the toilet." Suddenly, I wanted Vivi in the room after all. This was becoming very confusing, very quickly. There had been no unconscious guy in the bathroom, only Jordan and Paul. Was there something like that in the movie? "He wanted me to smash his head with the thing," Jordan said. "He told me it was meant to be the lid of the toilet tank, but that he tried smashing something with one and it broke too easily. It had to be like in the movie," he said. "I had to kill the unconscious man with it by smashing his—" But he said not yet. He said that, in the movie, the doctor cut his foot off and dragged himself to the other side of the room. So he walked over to Paul and he handed him a saw. Jordan kept going. His voice was a whisper again. Every time he took one of his shallow breaths, his whole body shook. "It's all right, Jordan," I said, reaching out to grab him by the shoulders. "You don't have to tell me this now. Just rest. Just try to calm down." But Jordan ignored me. He kept talking, as if I hadn't said anything at all. He had a gun. He pointed it at Paul and told him to cut his foot off at the ankle. Paul was really calm, I don't know how. Paul told the man that if he did what he wanted, he'd bleed to death very quickly. In 1 or 2 minutes, he said. The man didn't care. He told Paul he'd live if he did what he asked. All he had to do was crawl to me, then crawl outside, and the man would cauterize his wound and he'd live. Jordan took a deep breath. I was glad that he paused, and glad that he was breathing a little more regularly now. Paul said no. He tried to tackle the man. He almost got his gun. Almost. The man got very angry. He took a blackjack out of his robe. I shuddered. If you don't know what a blackjack is, they're retractable metal batons with a very hard tip. You can kill someone with them very easily, depending on where you hit them. They're illegal in our state. He hit Paul. Paul went limp. Then the man tied a blue shirt around Paul's ankle and... I know what he did next, I said. You don't have to tell me. Jordan nodded. There was a lot of blood. A lot. That worried him. He tried to stop it by pulling the shirt tighter, but it didn't work. Then he started checking for a pulse, started doing chest compressions. But Paul was dead. Even I knew that. I took a deep breath. It felt like I hadn't breathed since Jordan started talking. The man started shouting. He broke a mirror. He walked over to me and took the unconscious man out of the room. Then he walked back in, dragged Paul over to me and left. I thought I heard him whisper something before he left. Game over, Vivi said. What did I tell you? I asked. Vivi was pale, her eyes wide. Yeah, Jordan said. That sounds about right. From the movie? I asked. Vivi nodded. The doctors gave Jordan something so that he'd sleep, and Vivi and I walked out of the hospital into my car and drove home. We didn't talk the rest of the day. Whatever illusions I had about this being fun, about a sheriff and her daughter teaming up to catch a killer, were a distant memory. This was ugly. It made me sick. I scrolled through the horror category on Netflix, and I had to run across the room and puke in the kitchen sink. I don't think I'll ever be able to watch another horror movie again. I can tell that Vivi feels something similar. I asked her a few questions, mostly about the unconscious man that the man wearing a pig mask wanted Jordan to kill. She just told me to read about Saw online. She sent me a link to a wiki. I couldn't even look at it. Maybe someone can explain what the reference was in the comments. I'm having a hard time reading them either, especially the ones telling me to look at Vivi or her boyfriend as suspects. She's my daughter, not a character in a movie. There's no twist because there's no writer. This is real, as much as I wish that it weren't. I raised Vivi. She and Chris are my life, which is why this next part took me so long to write. Vivi said she wanted me to drive her over to her dad's. At the time, it seemed like a great idea. Mark had been blowing my phone up with dozens of missed calls, asking me where Vivi's daughter was, and when I told him that she was with me, he said that that's exactly what he was afraid of. He'd heard about Paul, of course. He knew about a few of the other ones too, but he didn't know they were done by the same person, like most people in town. I hadn't shared the horror movie references. As far as they were concerned, there was a string of strange murders taking place, culminating in Paul and Jordan being kidnapped and tortured. I drove Vivi over and dropped her off a few houses down. I didn't want to see Mark. I was afraid I'd punch him if I did. Be careful, Mom, Vivi said. The killer always goes after the detective in the movies. I'm not a detective, I said. I'm a sheriff police chief, remember? Vivi smiled at that. It was a weak smile. Not one of her best, but I was glad to see it. The next morning, I woke up to my door practically banging off its hinges. Someone was knocking on my front door frantically. I opened it to see Monica. She rushed into my apartment, pushing past me. What was she doing here? She's always down at the station doing... Oh no, something happened. Something bad. Really bad. Where were you? She asked. I fell asleep, I said, reaching for my phone. I'd left it on the couch under a cushion. The screen lit up with about 1 million calls from Mark, Monica, and practically everyone else in town. Don't say it, I said. Monica covered her mouth. Her hands were shaking, her eyes full of tears. She said the very thing I was dreading. I thought that, because I knew it was coming, the words wouldn't be that bad. I was wrong. The fact that I'd guessed them, that I'd imagined Monica saying them in my worst nightmares, just made it all 10 times worse, 100 times, 1 million times. It's Vivi, Monica said. They think she's going to pull through. I pushed past her and ran outside. Monica drove me to Mark's. I was glad she did. I would have ran every red light, would have slammed into every car in front of mine, would have tried running through everything in my way. Instead, I just sat in the passenger's seat, looking dead ahead, in a daze, sedated, terrified and numb at the same time. We pulled up to Mark's house. I stepped out. Mark rushed me immediately, slamming me against Monica's car, slapping me across the face, shouting in my ear. You did this, he said. This is your fucking fault. My deputies pulled him off me. One of them, Trevor, pinned Mark on the ground and threw cuffs around his wrists. "Let him go," I said. Trevor got off Mark, but Mark didn't move. He just lay there, burying his face into the grass and sobbing. I walked upstairs, went into Vivi's room, ignored the horror movie posters on the walls, and saw a pair of EMTs rolling her out on a stretcher with an oxygen mask on her nose and mouth. She was wet and wearing nothing but the towels they'd wrapped her in, but she was awake, her eyes half open. The EMTs kept tapping her on the face, kept telling her to stay awake. "She's alive," I said. "She's okay. Will she?" "Ma'am, we need to wait for the blood work to know for sure." I rode in the ambulance with Vivi and Monica. The EMTs filled me in. Mark heard a noise and saw someone jump out the window. He found Vivi in the bathtub, unconscious. The EMTs told us that she wasn't out for long, as far as they can tell. For the next few hours, I sat in Vivi's hospital room waiting for her to get back. The doctor said they'd flush her stomach, run some tests, start her off on an IV drip. One of my deputies found a sleeping pill bottle on Vivi's bedroom floor. They brought Vivi in, still groggy. She was in and out. It's a small town. They know me and they know her. The doctors are good and they watched her closely. Her blood work came back. Sleeping pills. Higher dose than recommended but not lethal. She should make a full recovery. No signs of brain damage, no respiratory depression, and she didn't ingest any water or vomit. "You'll be all right," I said, kissing Vivi on the forehead. Chris and I sat together through most of it. He was quiet, distant. His phone was out and unlocked. He scrolled through it, staring past the screen, eyes unfocused and glazed. His phone screen kept turning off, going into sleep mode. Chris would bring it up to his face and unlock it, only to stare past it once again. Then it locked up, and he'd do it again. We held hands, we hugged each other and cried, and hovered over Vivi while she slept. Chris kept asking the doctors if it was okay for her to sleep. He wanted her to be awake. The doctors said all the sleeping pills were out of her system, that she needed rest, oxygen, and the IV. Chris didn't like the oxygen. He told me he'd only seen it in movies when someone was about to die. My phone buzzed. A photo message. I unlocked my phone and opened it. It was a photo of Vivi's bathtub sent by one of my deputies. They drained the water out and found something on the bottom. Knives. My first thought was that it was knives, but it wasn't. It was a glove. The thumb was normal, but the other 4 fingers were knives. The bastard. That fucking bastard. "It happened just now," Monica shouted, rushing into the room. "What?" I asked. "The glove?" "What glove?" Monica asked. "No, it's Jake Marino." "My daughter's boyfriend?" I stood up so fast my head swam. "He did this?" "No, I don't know. I don't think so. His parents were out, but a neighbor saw a man running out of the driveway. He called us and a deputy went in and..." "What?" "They said he was killed in bed." "Stay with Vivi," I told Monica. I walked out of my daughter's hospital room. I don't even remember driving there. I only remember walking into Jake Marino's room and seeing the blood. I'd never seen so much blood before. It was all over the bed, on the floor, on the walls. There was a lot of it on the ceiling too. There was a hole in the bed. Deputies and the asshole ME were standing around it, looking like they were going to be sick. "We didn't know if we should wait for you," one of them said. I shone my flashlight into the hole. Jake Marino was inside. "I don't know horror movies, not even famous ones. I'll need your help for this one, Reddit. Tell me what movies he referenced. It has to be 2, right? Maybe if we find out we can solve this somehow. But without Vivi's help, I'm lost. I'm tired, and I just want this to be done." I was sitting outside Vivi's hospital room when Mark walked up to me. I stood up immediately and took a step back, as if I was expecting him to tackle me again. My head still hurt where he'd slammed it against my car door. Mark held up his hands, as if to show that he wasn't going to hurt me. That just made me even more mad. Mad at him, yes, but mostly mad at myself. Why was I scared of him? I had handcuffs, I had a badge, I had a taser, and I had a gun. He wasn't my husband anymore. Maybe I was scared because despite of my weapons and my badge and my uniform, he'd still slapped me. Mark had never hurt me before, not physically, but now that he had a line had been crossed, he could do it again. The deputies standing on either side of Vivi's door stood straighter. One of them took a step toward Mark. I held up my hand. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to see her," he said. "She's sleeping." Mark nodded. He was blonde, fit, and had a golfer's tan. Mark's father, my former father-in-law, thank God for that former, owned the biggest car dealership in town. He bought a lot of homes or had them built, then let Mark rent them out. I was too busy with work, they said. I had been drinking after my dad's death, a bit too much. I got distant. I got angry. After we split up, Mark got to keep our house. His house, I guess. It had never been mine. After I moved out, my place was a one-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town. My income wasn't enough to give Vivi and Chris the life they'd gotten accustomed to, so Mark got full custody. I saw my kids on weekends, but not every weekend because of work. "Maybe I made a mistake," Mark said. "Vivi's been acting out for the last couple of months, sneaking out like when she stayed over at yours a few days ago. She got a tattoo. She tell you about that?" "No," I said. "I just hope she wasn't doing drugs," Mark said. "How is this helping?" I asked. "Look, I have a lot of shit to do." "Then why aren't you doing it?" As much as I hated to admit it, as much as I wanted to punch his smug country club face in, Mark was right. "Watch him and Chris," I told my deputies. Then I walked out. I paced around my office, looking at the crime scene photos laid out below me on every available surface. Dead kids, too many of them. That was when it hit me. I felt like a character in a movie, a detective, looking over crime scene photos, trying to find the killer just beyond the frame, off camera, working a few hours before the photos were taken, taking lives and playing a sick game. This was like a movie, wasn't it? The killer had made sure of that. What if he wanted me to act the part, to make my own references? I thought back to C7N. It had to be the killer's favorite movie, if all of this was a reference to it. I'd seen it a few nights ago, with Vivi. I remembered it well. I remembered too how Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt had found the killer's address. Our town's local library was small but welcoming. It was pretty much all ran by Brenda Peterson and her husband Ralph. There were others, mostly volunteers, a committee, a board, etc. But Brenda and Ralph were the beating heart. They were always there, even at night. I walked up to Brenda. She's a thin woman in about her 70s. Fit, active, the type you see finishing a jog at 7 a.m. She was watching TikTok, of all things. "All the knowledge in this place and you're watching that," I said. "I've read more books than most people do in their lifetime," Brenda said with a smile. "Don't try to shame me for keeping up with the times. What can I help you with, Anna?" In C7N, Morgan Freeman notices that the killer is well read, so he makes a list of books the killer was referencing or would be interested in, and asks a shady guy from the FBI to give him a list of people who had checked them out. Now Brenda and I went way back. She'd worked at the library since I was a kid. That didn't make what I had to do easier. It made it harder. It's hard to lie to someone who's known you since you were little. You feel like they should know the way you talk, the way your face moves, that they knew when you were lying as a kid, so they should know now. Luckily, I didn't have to lie to her. Not really. I just had to bend the truth a little. Smudge it. But that's still wrong. Every cop knows that. "You heard about Paul and Jordan," I said. Not a question. It was an undeniable fact. Everyone in town had heard about them. "Yes," Brenda said, leaning in. Her eyes were wild with excitement she was trying very hard to keep under wraps. I could feel the air around us change, suddenly becoming charged with the sparks of small-town gossip. "We think that whoever did it likes violence," I said. "You know, gets off on it?" Brenda narrowed her eyes and nodded. "I was wondering if there's anyone in town who's been checking out gory books recently, or maybe violent movies." "I can't give out any information regarding our patrons," Brenda said. "It's ALA policy." "What?" I asked. "The American Library Association," Brenda said proudly. "I could help you if you subpoenaed me. Sorry." I should have guessed that librarians were loyal to their readers and upheld the ALA's standards like I was supposed to uphold the law. Still, I had to try something. "You can tell me if there was anyone suspicious in here, though," I said. "Or anyone new, someone who didn't fit in." Brenda's eyes lit up. I could do that, yes, she said. I'm almost certain. Yes, I said. Now, was there anyone wearing a hood? Acting strange? Hovering around the movie section, maybe? Looking at violent things? There was one person, Brenda said, wearing a black hood. He actually tried checking us some violent movies, but again, subpoena. Right, but you're not telling me what he checked out, I said. Just that he was acting strangely. So you're not giving out any confidential library records. You're a valuable witness in an ongoing police investigation. Was his name by any chance John? Brenda's eyes lit up again. How did you know that? She asked. He tried to register as John D. I told him that an initial wasn't allowed as a last name. He put in John Donovan. Did he put an address in when he registered for a library card? I asked. Oh, he didn't actually register, Brenda said. He didn't have an official ID. He didn't even get through all the personal details. Did he start to write an address, or maybe mention where he was staying? You know what was weird? He actually put in Donovan Street. That made me think his name was fake. What are the chances, right? That was all I needed. Donovan Street was full of businesses, restaurants, car dealerships, a laundromat. There weren't many residences there, but I knew one. Thanks, Brenda, I said. If anything comes of this, we'll ask you to testify as a witness. You think you'd agree to do that? Brenda perked up. Yes, of course, she said. What should I wear to court? If we ever catch this guy, I said, I'll let you know. The house on Donovan Street had been empty for years. Like the abandoned bus station, it was an eyesore. The owners of the neighboring businesses signed petitions every year, saying that the property drew in rats and the wrong kind of people, and that it was bad for business. Every year, old Mrs. Mayhew paid exterminators and landscapers to make the house look a little better, then went back to doing absolutely nothing with it. She didn't want to rent it, tear it down, or sell it. She just liked looking at it, she said, like driving past it. It was the perfect place for what I knew was coming. It'd be just like C7N. I didn't have to kick the door in. It was open a smidge. I pushed it with my foot. My hands were a little occupied, one with my service weapon, the other with my flashlight. Sheriff's Department, I shouted into the home. If there's anyone in there, make yourselves known and come out with your hands up. I heard the man before I saw him, the sound of boots slamming into the sidewalk getting closer and closer. I turned just in time to see a man wearing a hat and a leather coat drop a bag of groceries and raise a gun toward my head. He shot several times, at the wall mostly. I slid down to the sidewalk, rolled into the grass. For once I was furious at Mrs. Mayhew for having it cut. I looked up to see the man running into an alley between two of the restaurants. As I stood and started running, I noticed the dinner crowd and most of the waiters spilling out into the street, looking at me in an anxious daze. County Sheriff, I shouted, flashing my badge. Get back inside. I ran into the dark alley, my gun out and shaking in every direction. Every shadow, every trash bag, every nook, every dumpster. I was convinced every time that the killer would pop out. Was there any horror movie death that took place in an alley? I remembered one. The actress was the girl from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There a parade going on in town, and she was running through an alley. Right before she could escape out into the parade, the killer stabbed her with a hook. Was that going to be me? Was Vivi going to wake up in the hospital and hear that her mother was killed to reference some stupid horror movie? Vivi and Chris loved their weekends with me, loved a break from Mark. With me gone, they'd have nowhere to go. I heard footsteps again, then the whistle of something hard, metal and thin, shrieking through the air and slicing down in an arc. The blackjack hit me in the back of the head. I dropped instantly. My gun spilled out of my right hand and the flashlight out of my left. I turned around, looking up to see a black figure standing over me. I cowered. My hands rose up instinctually. I didn't want to get hit again. That's what was on my mind, all that was on my mind. I'd forgotten about the gun. I'd forgotten about the killings. I just didn't want him to hit me again. And he did. He brought the blackjack down on my left forearm. I heard it snap before I felt it. The figure above me pressed his gun into the side of my head. I could have tackled him. I could have tried something clever, but my head was a mess and my arm hurt. That was my world, just that pain and the feet that more pain could be coming my way. The gun left my head and the man walked away. As I lay in the alley hugging my broken arm, I kept thinking about the fact that, in C7N, the killer overpowers Brad Pitt's character in an alley and lets him live. After that scene, Brad Pitt's character wears a cast for the rest of the film. Say what you will about the killer, he was making me remember a lot of details about horror movies. If that was his goal, then he was accomplishing it. I stood and walked out of the alley. The world was a blurry, intangible mess, but I did my best to keep it steady. I had to walk back into the house. There was something there. I was sure of it. I crawled up the stairs, dragged myself through the front door and made my way into the house. And it was empty. Completely empty. In the film, the detectives enter the killer's apartment and discover that it's filled with hundreds of notebooks explaining the killer's motives, as well as religious iconography and 7 display cases for elements used in each of the crime scenes. There was none of that. It was just the same empty eyesore of a property that Mrs. Mayhew refused to rent or sell or tear down. I collapsed on the floor, vaguely aware of the police sirens and the shouts outside the front door. And there, beneath me on the hardwood floor, was a single Polaroid photo. I picked it up with my good hand. It was a photo of a bookshelf. No, of one corner of a bookshelf. There were a few DVDs, 6 to be exact, C7 and Scream, The Ring, The Exorcist, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Saw. The last thing on the shelf was an old VHS tape, loose. There was no label because there was no box. It was a black spine. The label was on the other side, facing the other films or the shelf. I slipped the photo in my pocket, even if I felt like balling it up and throwing it away in anger. I had walked into the house hoping to find notebooks filled with the killer's thoughts. I wanted a dozen notebooks, one for each film. Instead, all I found was a photo. But maybe the photo accomplished the same thing. Maybe it said that, instead of notebooks, the films were what the killer had seen again and again. Those films on that shelf. A black shelf in the corner of a room with a white wall. It could be anyone's room, anyone's shelf, anyone's movies, but it looked vaguely familiar. I tried thinking in the haze if I had ever been to Jordan's house, or maybe it was the shelf on the library, or I felt myself collapse, but it was a distant thing. Someone else's pain. Someone else's body hitting the ground. I woke up in a hospital bed. My left arm was in a cast. The room's light was too bright, too blurry, too much all at once. Mark and Chris were standing in front of me. So were a few of my deputies. I tried getting out of bed immediately. "What are you doing?" Mark asked. "The doctor said you suffered a concussion." "What?" I asked. Mark repeated what he'd said and told me that it was exactly why I had to stay in bed. "I'm fine," I said. "What are you going to do if I leave? Arrest me?" The deputies in front of the door looked at each other, like they were unsure what to do. Mark reached out to steady me, and I pushed him away so hard he hit the wall. "Mom!" Chris shouted. I turned to look at him. I had been so wrapped up in the case, so focused on it and on Vivi, that I had barely thought about my son. What must he think seeing me like this? Seeing his sister in another hospital room with an oxygen mask? I reached out to him and he recoiled, taking a step back. "Let's go, Chris," Mark said, grabbing my son's hand. "We've been here too long." I pointed at the 2 deputies. "Follow them and stand watch outside the house." "No," Mark said. "You want to be useful? Watch her." He motioned to me violently. I flinched at the way his hand shot out. "Make sure she stays in bed, takes her painkillers, does whatever the doctor says. She's not thinking clearly because of the concussion." The deputies looked at each other again and stayed in the room. One of them led me back to my bed and helped me onto it. "Send a patrol car," I said. "To the house." "We will, Sheriff," the deputy said. "You should get some rest." I slipped out of consciousness again. I don't know for how long, but when I woke up, my phone was ringing. I dragged myself out of bed, reached the chair on the other side of the room, slid my finger across the screen, and put the phone to my ear. A deep voice was on the other end. The first time the killer had used a voice changer, it sounded like the killer in Scream. This time, he sounded like Jigsaw. "If you want your son to live," the voice said, "follow my directions." On the phone, the killer told me to go to the church on our town's main street. He said almost nothing else, ignoring every question I shouted, every concern I had about Chris's well-being. "Get there in the next 15 minutes, the killer said, "or I'll stab him 7 times. I didn't go to church often, but I knew where the church in question was. I estimated that, on a day without traffic, it was probably about 10 minutes away from the hospital. So I had around 5 minutes to get out of the hospital and 10 to drive to the church. If I was right, that left me no time to get out of my car, no time to climb the church steps, no time to burst through the doors and do what? Confront the killer. Stop him. There must be hundreds of horror movies where someone is killed in a church. I couldn't think of any. All I could think about was the killer's obsession with the number 7. I looked at the clock on my phone screen. I had wasted an entire minute. I grabbed my uniform off the chair in the room. They'd taken my gun and flashlight. One of my deputies was probably holding it for me, but I didn't have the time to find one and ask them for it. Hell, I couldn't even risk one of them seeing me. If they did, they might ask me where I was going, or why I needed my gun, or why I wasn't in bed. They'd probably try to convince me that I needed rest. That conversation could very well take 10 minutes or even 15. I couldn't risk it. My hospital room was on the first floor. The room's window didn't open, but the bathroom window did. I pulled it open, climbed on the cabinet, and pushed myself out of the small window and onto the parking lot below. How many minutes had that taken? Too many. I found my car keys in my jacket pocket and unlocked my car. There was a gun in my glove compartment. I grabbed it, stuck the keys in the car's ignition, started the engine, pulled out of the driveway and drove. I don't know how long it took me. I just know that I turned on the lights and the siren and drove like a madwoman. I never hit the brakes, not once. I swerved and blasted the horn and ran a few red lights until finally, my car was in front of the church. I didn't have the time to drive around the block and into the church's parking lot. No. I drove onto the curb and onto the church's first steps. Then I pushed the driver's side door open, fell out of the seat, and ran up the stairs. I burst through the church doors and saw it. My stomach dropped. My heartbeat was a pounding, overpowering presence. I could see it in my eyes, could feel it in my trembling, tingling fingers as they held a gun that felt cold and wet. Chris was lying on the altar, trying to squirm away as a hooded man held him in place. There was a knife in the man's hand. He held it above his head, the thin blade glinting, frozen in place. Then it started to move, to slice down in an arch, to drop closer to my son's chest. I didn't think. I just moved. I raised my gun and shot the man. The first bullet hit him in the shoulder. The next one hit him in the neck. I don't know where the others hit him. I just know that none of them missed. The man dropped, twisting as he fell. My adrenaline turned the world into a slideshow. Every time I blinked, I moved without knowing it. I blinked once, and I was at the altar, reaching out to Chris and asking him if he was okay. I blinked again, and I was lifting his shirt to check for blood or cuts or wounds. Nothing. I blinked once more, and I was standing over the man, kicking the knife away from his hand. I took a deep breath and the world seemed to steady. I reached down and pulled the man's hood back. And it was Mark, my ex-husband, Chris's father. My deputies arrived on the scene a few minutes later. They didn't ask me anything. What had happened was obvious. And that's when it hit me. The crime scene was obvious. It left no doubt or room for interpretation. Anyone who saw it would understand that my ex-husband had kidnapped my son and was going to kill him on the church altar. The knife was near his hand and there were 6 other blades laid out next to my son. It was ritualistic, strange, sick, satanic maybe. They put Chris in an ambulance and gave him something for the shock. He was unhurt, not even a scratch as far as they could tell. He was just shaken up and still groggy from whatever the killer had given him to knock him out. Chloroform, most likely. I didn't think about horror movies on the ride over to the hospital. I just thought about Mark. We had gotten married in that church. I kept seeing him in a tux, kept hearing him laughing because he'd said yes instead of I do, kept seeing him shooting nervous glances at his father, as if he was willing to stop the whole thing if my very soon-to-be father-in-law shook his head, gave him a disapproving look, or frowned. Mark was behind it all. It seemed unbelievable, like a bad twist, a bad ending. something I should have seen coming. A few people had guessed in the comments. There were only so many suspects after all, and this was like a movie, wasn't it? In C7N, undoubtedly the killer's favorite movie, one of the detectives shot the serial killer. It had been part of the serial killer's plan. He won, in a way, because his plan was to reference the 7 deadly sins. Is that what had happened here? But in C7N, that scene had taken place in a field outside the city, and the killer hadn't kidnapped the detective's son. It wasn't a reference. 7 movies in total, right? We were up to 6. C7N, Scream, The Ring, The Exorcist, Saw, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Whatever the movie was, the scene had to be similar. I couldn't place it, and it didn't even matter anymore. Mark was dead. Vivi came to see me later. She was fine, ready to be released. She gave me a hug. "I can't believe it was Dad," she said. That made me think of what had happened again, of what I had done. I had shot Vivi's father, Chris's father. Chris wasn't talking, and he probably wouldn't talk for a while. I couldn't imagine what he must be feeling. His own father had tried to kill him in a sick, sacrificial, ritualistic way, and then his mother had killed his father right in front of him, and he'd get through it. I'd help him. We all would, as a family. The next few days were a blur. That's why it's taken me a while to update this. That's why the days are off. It's taken me more than 7 days to write and publish the story, but all of the events happened exactly in 7 days. Writing with only one hand didn't help either. Our lawyer came to see me at my apartment later. He was holding a sealed envelope. He said it was Mark's will. He'd written it a few years ago and never updated it. In it, he left me his house, all his belongings, all his money, and the properties he rented out. Vivi and Chris were in the room when the lawyer read the will. Vivi hugged me. Chris was still shaken up, sitting away from us, staring off into empty space. Later that day, Vivi and Chris insisted that I stay with them in Mark's house, our house now. The lawyer said that with Mark gone, and especially with the circumstances he had gone in, I'd get full custody of Vivi and Chris. No one would question it, he said. It had only been a few days, but people in town were already calling me a hero. I was sure that I would get fired, exposed for not revealing the evidence sooner. One day, I walked into my office and there was a woman sitting at my desk. She was from the bureau. She'd read the things I posted online. The world lurched, my stomach dropped. This was it. I'd just gotten Vivi and Chris back, and now I was going to lose them and lose my job, and everyone in town was going to know that I'd hidden this from them. If I had revealed the horror movie thing, maybe some of the victims could have lived. Maybe the town itself would have been more careful, more alert, known what to watch out for. "I know what you've been going through," the woman said. "The letter, the game, the manipulation." I didn't ask her what she meant. I got a feeling that I shouldn't. "We found it when we were looking into the crime scenes in your place, of course." She handed me a typed-in a plastic sleeve. Evidence. I started reading. "Hello, Sheriff," the letter began. "I want to play a game. Over the next 7 days I will kill 7 people. If you don't play along, I will kill many more. You see, I've always loved horror movies, and I want to make one of my own. Each one of my murders will be a reference to one of my favorite horror movies, and I expect you to play the role of the cop, my adversary in a way. I want you to play your role well. If you reveal these letters to anyone around you, or if you share anything about my love of movies to your deputies or the people in town, I will choose to reference a movie with a much higher kill count." I imagined the killer chuckling at that, a sick laugh, like the killers in Scream. "Did you know that in the old movie the Invisible Man kills 120 people by derailing a train? Maybe I'll do something like that if you don't play along. I want you to type up what you find in each crime scene and post it. Make it like a horror story. I'll provide the link below. Make it suspenseful. Don't mention this letter. Don't mention the threats. Make it a surprise." I had never seen that letter before, but it was how I was going to get away with everything. Writing these posts, not telling anyone about the horror movie connection. The killer had thought of everything. I wasn't to blame. I didn't hide the evidence because I was selfish and scared. I didn't obstruct justice by posting the stories on here. I was just following a sick killer's directions, right? Except that I wasn't. I hadn't been. And the killer and I both knew it. So why was he protecting me? I thanked the agent and drove back home. I was settling into my room when I decided to go into Vivi's. She was at school at the time. I hadn't been in the room, in the house, since they'd found her in the bathtub. Vivi had insisted on painting her room with dark purple walls and a black ceiling. Each wall was covered in horror movie posters. Halloween, Friday the 13th, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, House of 1,000 Corpses. There was a poster that caught my eye. It was a black and white poster of a woman wearing a strange contraption on her head. "How much blood would you be willing to shed to stay alive?" it read. "Saw" was written on the bottom in red. I looked around the room again. There was a black shelf in the corner. Vivi had filled it with books, movies, and those little Funko Pop toys. I walked over to it. There near the wall was a row of DVDs and one VHS tape. C7 in Scream, The Ring, The Exorcist, Saw, A Nightmare on Elm Street, and a black VHS tape with no box. I remembered suddenly the Polaroid picture I'd found in Mrs. Mayhew's abandoned house. I was expecting a room filled with hundreds of notebooks explaining the killer's motives, like in C7N. Instead, I'd only found one picture, of this, a picture of Vivi's shelf. I grabbed the VHS tape and pulled it out. The Omen. I'd seen the movie many years ago, in theaters. It was an old movie even when I was a kid, but they'd re-released it. I'd actually seen it with Mark first. Vivi, Chris, and I watched the remake too a few times. How could I have missed it? The movie's about a boy who's revealed to be the Antichrist. People die around him in freak accidents, and his father discovers his true nature. The boy's father takes him to a cathedral, sets him on the altar, and is about to kill him by stabbing him with 7 sacred daggers. Just as he's about to stab him the first time, the cops burst in and shoot him, saving the boy. The villain wins, just like in C7N and the first Saw movie, and The Ring, and A Nightmare on Elm Street. But that wasn't the pattern. The real pattern, the one I had been looking for, was that the killer had picked the movies out for a reason. To emulate Vivi's shelf, to pay homage to it, or maybe not. What do I know anyway? I don't know horror movies. I went around Vivi's room with a garbage bag. She didn't need the clutter, didn't need to look at anything that could remind her of what we had all gone through. So I put all her horror movies in the bag in the Polaroid, and any receipts I found. Her horror movie posters too. I found some old shoes with mud, so I threw those in there. A black hoodie, gloves. She didn't need them. Then I put the bag in one of the gated community's dumpsters and hung out with Vivi and Chris for a while. She wasn't mad that I'd thrown her stuff away. She looked relieved, actually. She was happy for the first time in a while. We made small talk. She showed me her tattoo, a missing puzzle piece. She said she'd get it filled in, to show that what was missing was now back in her life. I could tell she meant me. It made me happy. Maybe that's how this story ends. A happy ending, all things considered. The killer dying by my hand, referencing a horror movie in his final moments. Mark had access to Vivi's room after all. He would have seen that shelf a lot. Mark didn't own a black truck, didn't know horror movies, didn't know Reddit. But so what? Maybe he did. Or maybe there could be another ending. I'm just making it up here. Like an alternate scene, you know? Something on the special features of a horror movie's DVD. In it, maybe Jordan comes to my new home and tells me he found a tape in Mark's pocket. Maybe I ask him if he showed it to anyone and he says no. Maybe I play the tape and it's the killer, telling Mark to go to the church and to raise a knife over Chris. If he does it, Chris will be unharmed. He has to trust him. Maybe I get worried, so I go to the tattoo parlor. Maybe I ask the artist who did Vivi's tattoo if she was with someone. Maybe he tells me it's a boy from one town over. A loner type, wears grunge-style clothing, drives a black truck. Maybe I hide outside Vivi's school. Maybe I wait for a black truck to drive by. Maybe I follow it. Maybe I run it off the road. Maybe I force the guy out and walk him over to a field. Maybe, like so many of you mentioned, I say that we're going to reference C7N again, the killer's favorite movie. Maybe he begs. Maybe he tells me it was all Vivi's idea, that she was Jigsaw and he was her apprentice, that she wanted all this, that she hated her dad. Maybe I shoot him in the head and then empty the entire clip into him. Maybe I put him in one of the many holes that lead to old mine shafts, or down an old well, and drive his car into a lake or a pond. Maybe, just maybe, I want to reference a movie too. One of the ones that ends on a happy note. Maybe I don't even care who's behind it. I'm just happy I got my kids back after all. I don't know what I'd do if I lost them. Maybe one day I'll delete this story and any reference of it. Anyway, I have to go. I'm taking Vivi to the tattoo parlor. She wants to get her tattoo filled in. She said it's a loose end, that the tattoo artist would remember that her tattoo was unfinished, would have it in her records, or on video. Loose ends are no good. Vivi says she'll think of a horror movie on the way or make one up on her own. If it's a slasher movie, she said, there'd be lots of ways to kill someone with a tattoo gun.